joining me this evening as I share a little bit about Jane Murray Sheldon. And there's Jane now. That's the most recognizable, and until recently, the only picture that I had actually seen of Jane Sheldon. And it actually is also in the case right here behind our screen. There are some Sheldon family materials in there that have been donated to us. And so this wasn't something that I planned, to tell you the truth. I didn't go, oh, I got to learn more about Jane Sheldon. I've learned bits and pieces about the Sheldon family through my work here with the museum and developing different presentations and different content. But our local Daughters of the American Revolution chapter, the Jane Sheldon chapter of the Daughters of American Revolution, approached me about 2 to 3 years ago and said, Greg, our chapter is actually named after Jane Sheldon. We'd really like to know more about her. I mean, we just kind of have scraps around the edges, but we'd like to learn more about Jane. So I started this project of learning more about Jane Sheldon, who she was, how she ended up becoming here and getting here to Florida, and it really ends up being a fascinating story. And fortunately, in her 70s, Jane sat down at the urging of her children and hand wrote out a written account of her life during the Indian War years here in Florida while she was a young mom and pioneer housewife here in what we know as the state of Florida today. And actually, there is a copy of Jane's written in ink, handwritten notes on both sides of onion skin paper. That's the way they were actually originally captured. I did not have to transcribe these, and I am really, really glad. We have several copies of transcriptions. If you stare at it long enough, you can start to see what's on this side of the page and what's reversed and kind of pick up the words on there. It's a little, I start getting cross-eyed real quick. But then you go, okay, well, so here's Jane with this life in Florida, but who is Jane? How did she actually end up here in Florida? Jane's parents actually ended up in Florida before Jane was ever born. Her dad, George Murray, and her mom, also named Jane. Jane referred to her mom as Jenkins. But George Murray was an engraver in Philadelphia in the late 1700s. Continental currency had collapsed, and the U.S. government had authorized several regional and state banks to create banknotes and some of their own currency. And engravers were artisans back then. And her dad was an engraver that created banknotes. And so he was very, his business was very prolific in Philadelphia. Jane says he did very well for himself there. And when the Spanish took back over the peninsula of Florida from Britain, instead of trying to populate Florida with Spanish people again, like they had for the first 250 years that they had the state, they were trying to find U.S. citizens to come down here and accept land grants from them and help them bring colonists or people to come and take on land grants in Florida and populate this land. And that's why George Murray ends up cashing out of Philadelphia. He buys a boat, and him and his wife Jane come to Florida, and they take on 2 land grants here in Florida. They take on one. One in Mandarin, and their second land grant. Mandarin is up by Jacksonville, by the way. It's actually a suburb. Jacksonville's kind of grown around it now. But they took on a land grant in the Mandarin area, and also a land grant here, right in the area where New Smyrna, where Edgewater and Oak Hill come together. Corey Estates is right here, and the George Murray land grant, 600 acres down there. George and Jane Murray came down here to make a go of it. In 1803, they came to Florida. He was going back and forth, bringing other people down from the Northeast to take on land grants, and they found it as difficult as just about everyone did here in Florida that was trying to make a go of it in the early 1800s. The Native Americans are still very much anchored in the fact that this is where they live and that other people shouldn't be coming here and taking that land from them. And so due to Native American difficulties, and within 2 years, George and Jane Murray end up in St. Augustine harboring for safety where there's population, they eventually give up and they go back to Philly. They go back to Philadelphia and just leave their land grants here, and he goes back to where he knows he can actually have an income and actually have a lifestyle. So they're back in Philadelphia. Jane says that again, her dad falls right back into the engraving business, both with banknotes, and by the time he returns, there's several large magazines that are hiring engravers there in the Philadelphia area as well. Jane is actually born September 13th, 1812. This painting was done of the 4th of July celebration the same year there in Philadelphia. And as I was reading a little bit about Philly to learn about it, I didn't realize that in the late 1700s, there was one point in time that 10% of the population of Philadelphia died of yellow fever. They had some massive health outbreaks there. And they say that this painting is actually a Renaissance kind of a celebration of where Philadelphia is at in the early 1800s, with the fountain in the background with fresh water. If you study this thing closely, there are black folks in here commingling with the white people. Everyone, different social classes are together. The dogs are even getting along in Philadelphia. Everything's really going well. And that was the Philadelphia that Jane was born into and where she lived for the first 9 years of her life there. By the time Jane turns 9 years old, her dad passes away. And it's just her and her mom. There's actually 6 siblings total. Jane is the youngest of 6. There's 3 boys and 3 girls. Some of the research that I did, and thanks to Kim Dulce and the Volusia County Library for her help, one of our founding members, Larry Sweet, who's a descendant of the Sheldon family, had done a lot of genealogical research, and our own Sheldon Research Library upstairs had a lot of materials that I was able to use to actually gather this info. But Larry Sweet, in some of his annotations, says that that Jane Murray starts selling off family assets. She sells off all the family silver. They let go of the family house. They're taking in sewing. They're trying to figure out how they can make a go of it in Philadelphia with the head of the household not there any longer. And they finally abandon Philadelphia and come back to Florida to a place called Panama City. Not Panama City, but Panama Mills, which is actually in Jacksonville, Florida. Panama Mills was a brick, kiln, and lumber mill that was right up in what is the northeastern quadrant of Jacksonville today. And a guy named Sebald actually had started that business. He was from Philadelphia. I don't know if Jane Murray might have heard of his endeavor or met him up there. Somehow she hears about this. Jane and her mom both moved to Panama Mills, and they're there for about 2 years. Working at the mill as support staff. I'm not sure what exactly they were doing in the area. But their land grant, right down here on the St. John's coming south, is where that original Murray land grant had been acquired. After they had been there at Panama Mills for 2 years, the mill burned to the ground. And so again, they need some place to be. And they end up leaving from up here and coming right back down to the land grant that the family owned, and setting up house and creating a place there where they could actually live. The mill was actually rebuilt, by the way, and from reading a little bit more about Jacksonville, they say when it hit its big building boom, a lot of the early years of Jacksonville were built out with bricks from the Panama mill and their lumber as well. So that's the land that is the Murray land grant there in Mandarin, Florida. These are some scenes from that land. George Murray certainly knew how to pick a great spot. This is actually a county park now and boat launch. The Mandarin Historical Society maintains the buildings on the property and has a small museum there. And it looks really gorgeous. I'm actually going to be up there next week visiting. But by the time they settle, Jane and her mom settle on this Mandarin property. Jane is about 15, 16 years old. And it's about 1827, 1828 is the years that they actually end up residing there. And that is where she's actually living just a few years later when she meets John Sheldon, who would eventually become her husband. John and her meet there in the Jacksonville area. They end up getting married in that area. They live with Jane's mom there for about 3 years before they eventually come down here to New Smyrna. I did a little research through Larry Sweet's genealogy papers on the Sheldon family. And John Sheldon, that we know as John Sheldon, is actually the 16th generation of the Sheldon family line that can be traced back to a guy named Richard Sheldon, who was born in 1385 in Bakewell County, Derby, England. The family lineage is actually credited with creating the Sheldon tapestries. And there have been a couple of them auctioned off in the art world in the last 10 or 15 years, and they go for huge, huge dollars. They were some of the first maps that were done of these larger, more predominant counties there in England. And they're very much sought after by collectors today. But here in the United States, the Sheldon family is actually known for battling with Indians, or Native Americans, as they're referred to today. And in the Massachusetts state up there, there are some big stories about the Sheldon family that precedes the John Sheldon that we know, and their interactions with Native Americans there in Massachusetts. And one of the most famous stories surrounds a famous door that was built by a Sheldon 3 generations prior to our John Sheldon. And his name was John Sheldon. And he lived in a house with his son, also named John Sheldon, which makes it really confusing. I know Kim Dulce probably knows this. If you recycle the same name over and over, it makes it really hard later on to figure out who's who. But the dad builds this house in 1699. He knew that the house would have to be fortified to protect against incursions from Native Americans. They were having troubles up there as well, still at that point in time. And so he reinforces the house with this massive reinforced oak door. And the door becomes famous because, of course, the house gets attacked by Native Americans at one point in time. In 1704, the raid on Deerfield. The older John Sheldon is actually not home at the time, but the younger John and his wife and the mother are at home. And the house is under siege. The younger husband and the younger John Sheldon and his wife jump out of a second-story window to try and run away and get help. And when she hits the ground, she sprains her ankle. And so she crawls back through a lower-story window to help load weapons with the people in the house. And he takes off to go and get help to Hartford. By the time he gets back, the house has been overrun. His mom's dead. There were only 2 people killed in the incursion. They only succeeded, after chopping on this door for a while, at punching a small hole in the door. And one musket ball that got through that hole actually killed the younger John's mom. She was sitting on the bed there. And there was also a toddler that was lost in the fighting there. But the younger John gets home. His wife's been captured. The house is all in disarray. Actually, the house gets overrun because of all the great work that goes into that door. Someone who decided to flee the house left the back door open. And they said that actually accounted for the incursion inside the house and them actually losing the house. So ironically enough, the older John Sheldon comes back, realizes what's happened. He has some connections with the government. He goes to Quebec, to French Canada, and he negotiates the release of his daughter-in-law and brings her home to his son. And he's so successful at negotiating with the French government there. The U.S. government sends him back several times. And all told, he brings 113 Americans back home that have been captured by Native Americans and taken and turned over to the French. Our John Sheldon is actually the son of Arid Sheldon. And Larry Sweet speculates in his notes, he writes, in view of the considerable history the Sheldon family's involvement with the Indians and massacres in Massachusetts, it's not improbable that John and his brother came to Florida with adventure in mind. And so this was still kind of the wild end of the United States down here at that point in time. So Jane and her new husband lived there in Mandarin with her mom for 3 years. Their first 2 children are born there in Mandarin. A youngster named Louisana, who died at 2 months old, and another daughter named Sarah Jane, who only lived to the age of 2. And they are both buried on that property there in Mandarin. At about that point in time, John Sheldon, Jane's husband, the younger John, is hired to be the manager of the sugar mill here in New Smyrna Beach. The original manager, a man named Stamps, who owned the riverfront down here in the area that we know as Old Fort Park today. Stamps was the manager of the sugar mill. His house that he had built for himself was on the mound down here in this area, right across from where we are right now. But for whatever reason, Stamps was no longer at the mill. And so they hired John Sheldon to come down and be the on-site manager. He brings his wife and he brings his mother-in-law, and they move into Stamps' house on the mound there in Old Fort Park. Some of this I'm going to read you are Jane's words out of her actual transcript. And this is one of her descriptions. She says, "The plantation was a village in itself, and on the southern end of town, facing the Indian River, was the manager's house, the use of which was given to my husband. The dwelling was large and comfortable, and amply provided with servants taken from the estate slaves." And Florida was a slave state at that time. And there is some writings in this. I don't think there's anything too far off the deep end that I need to put a disclaimer out there. But there's definitely some dialogue in this that we would not see as appropriate today, just with the way they refer to people. They move here. It's a short-lived stay here in New Smyrna Beach, because it's only just a few days until the beginning of the Second Seminole Indian War. I don't know how many days, or even if it was a whole week that John and Jane were here, but the negotiations break down between the powers that are negotiating with the Native Americans here in Florida. And this depicted scene says that this is basically when Osceola drove his knife through the agreement and the table and stormed out of the room. And it was obvious that there wasn't going to be any more talking about how things were going to go here in Florida. And one morning, shortly after they arrived, a young servant shows up at the house that the Sheldons are living in and relates that she has been at a plantation north of here the night before at a holiday get-together. It's just a few days before Christmas. And she says at the gathering there were 9 Native Americans that showed up, and all of their faces were painted. And she said, that's not good. And almost immediately after this servant shows up, the owner of that plantation is like minutes behind her and shows up at the Sheldon's house and basically says, "You got to pack. We have to get out of here right now. We can't be here when the sun goes down." And Jane writes, she says, "Mr. Sheldon acted on Mr. Hunter's advice, aiding my mother and I to collect and pack our belongings. Each trunk, as it was filled to capacity, was placed on one of the 2 lighters tied to the dock in front of the house. With a great deal of hard work, we completed our task at sundown, and judging it unsafe to remain at the house any longer, the 3 of us got in a small boat and crossed the river to a hill where Captain Dummett, a friend of ours, lived." And she's talking about Captain Douglas Dummett and his home site on our beach side. Douglas Dummett was one of the first beachside residents here in New Smyrna Beach. His house set just off the end of Cowalissa Creek. There's still some remnants of a shell mound there, and of course a newer structure that sits on that property today. The grave that sits in the middle of Canova Drive is actually Charles Dummett, Douglas Dummett's son, that's buried there on his father's old property. And so they go over and they're at Dummett's house. Jane continues. She said, "We also found Mr. Hunter was there before we got there. The other guy is already at Dummett's house. She says, watching from our eminence, we could see the fires of the village started by the Indians. When they entered the town about midnight, not a building was left standing. With the Indians so near, our party decided it was unsafe to remain where we were any longer. Ordering the slaves to follow us as soon as the tide was favorable, we set out for Mosquito Inlet, 3 miles north. Fortunately, a schooner was at the inlet, on which my husband placed my mother and I, while he went back to Captain Dummett's to get our trunks and our slaves. However, his journey was useless. We had no sooner left the hill than the slaves crossed the river and joined the Indians, taking our 2 lighters and Captain Dummett's large boat. The Indians had already started across in a raft, so they met the slaves midstream and all returned to the hill. As Mr. Sheldon got near our friend's place, he could see the Indians breaking open our trunks and destroying our goods. Mr. Sheldon came back with the sad news that we had lost everything we had in the world except the clothes we had on. So basically everything's gone. All their household goods are gone. I had to look up what a lighter was. I always think big, right? Big lighter. A lighter is actually a reference to a small boat that has flat portions on the end, kind of like this, where they can secure a rope and pull it up from both sides to pull it up on a ship or drop it back down off of a ship and just move materials back and forth on the water. And you can tow them behind other boats to move goods and stuff around. So John comes back up to the inlet. They get on the schooner that's there and they head up the river towards Bulow Plantation. And Jane says that they spend what she calls a most disagreeable night in the intercoastal there, waiting until they can sail on, because she says they're too scared to light even a smudge fire for giving away their position. And she said the mosquitoes just eat them. They just keep them up all night, basically. All right. So Bulow Plantation, and where they left from is actually south of here even a little bit. They make their way all the way up the river, up to the Bulow Plantation and Sugar Mill Ruins area, way up in Flagler, near Flagler Beach today. So they make it to Bulow. They're safe. They're out of here where the Native Americans are attacking, and they decide they need to dispatch someone to St. Augustine to get some help. So they've got some extra guns to move everyone from Bulow up to St. Augustine where it's safe. Well, they send a guy to St. Augustine. He comes back 2 days later and he goes, "There's not any help." He goes, "There's no help in St. Augustine." And so they go, "Okay, well, we'll just wait here." The men get together. They fortify a picket around the house, kind of a way to maybe try and repel an attack. And they think it can't be too long before someone comes here to help us out. Well, 6 weeks later, they're still there, and no one has showed up. And they're running out of food by then. The military militias are forming at this time, and by then there's a group of men from New Smyrna that are all in Bulow. They're led by Captain Douglas Dummett, and they refer to themselves as the Mosquito Roarers. They're all from here in the New Smyrna, the Mosquito Inlet area, and they are the militia that's going to keep everyone safe. They join with some other troops, and they decide to make their way back down here to Dunlawton Plantation. And when I first read Jane's account of this, of these gentlemen coming home, I didn't realize she was writing her perspective account of the Battle of Dunlawton, is basically what she was writing about. And so the guys come from up here, back down to Dunlawton, in hopes that there's some food. They're looking for provisions. They say they get there, they pull their boats up on the shore, they hike in, and they're thrilled to see that there's a bunch of cattle around. The Native Americans had actually gathered some heads of cattle. There were some gardens still in place there, likely some food around. One of the guys with him takes a pot shot at a Native American that he sees in the woods and hits him and alerts all the other Native Americans that they can't see that they're there, and they get overrun. They get just overrun by people. And they say that they're battling as best they can while trying to retreat at the same time. They get back to the river, and the tide has gone out. And their boat's up there, and the water's down there. And they're dodging musket balls, trying to get their boats back into the river so that they can actually escape and get out of there. Jane says that almost every man was wounded. She said there was two, a slave and another younger man, that were killed in the actual battles. But she said by the time they got everybody back up here to Bulow, that everybody was wounded and in some state of disrepair. She says that there was luckily a doctor there with them. He starts working on people. John Sheldon, her husband, has 2 musket balls in him. They dig one out of his forehead, and the other one, Jane says, is in the meat of his arm. And she said since it was only a flesh wound, he carried it for the rest of his life. They didn't even try to dig it out of him. They just left it. And so they do finally get away and to St. Augustine. They get everybody up to St. Augustine. And Jane is actually pretty proud. She said, you know, we took such good care of those men that only 2 more of them died between us, you know, when them getting back and getting to St. Augustine, which was probably pretty good for a time when there's no antibiotics or anything, you know, to care for people. She says that they stayed in a place called the Livingston House for 2 weeks while John got stronger. And then she says we moved into a private house and food was given to us by the government. And there are a couple of houses that were actually existing in St. Augustine at that time. These were both built in the late 1700s. This one, actually middle 1700s. They remain there in St. Augustine for 2 years, or at least Jane does. John signs up for as many military deployments as he can, him and his brother. And he goes out on 5 different deployments, anywhere from 3 to 6 months. He spends a lot of time being gone while she's back in Mandarin. But while they're in St. Augustine, Jane has twins, a girl named Clementina and a boy named George. Clementina dies at birth. George ends up being Jane's first child that actually lives for any real period of time. And there's a picture of him from his Confederate War days. She said while she was in St. Augustine, before they went back to Mandarin, that she saw several slaves and Indians brought into St. Augustine. She said they were moving the Native Americans west into the Indian territories. But she said she also recognized several of the slaves from the Kruger de Peister sugar plantation here in New Smyrna that had actually partnered with the Native Americans. And common enemies make friends pretty quick, even back in those days. You've got people in the state that have been here forever, and other people in the state that aren't here because they chose to be here. They're here because they're owned by someone, and they're forced to be here. And they end up fighting together in the Second Seminole Indian War. But they make it back to Mandarin. John's away in the military. Jane, of course, continues to have children. She has Victoria, which Victoria ends up being well known here in New Smyrna Beach. And another young man named Henry is born there. One evening while John's away, while they're in Mandarin, a neighbor shows up at the house and he says, "We got to get to safety. The Native Americans are attacking farmers in the area." And Jacksonville, anything north of St. Augustine at that time, was really considered a much safer area than being south of St. Augustine, where all the warring was going on between those militias and the Native Americans. And so Jane says she gathers up the kids, she walks about a mile to a small village and finds a bunch of other people gathered up there, and they all get in some smaller boats and go out onto a schooner that's like derelicted there in the river, and they spend a week out on this schooner harboring. They eventually send someone out. He confirms, I think, that 4 families had been killed and several farms had been burned, but it looked like all the aggressors had left the area, and so everyone makes their way back to their farms. And this is around 1837 is when they move back to Mandarin, and they end up spending about 6 years there at that point in time. And there are some pictures of Victoria. There's Victoria and Jane. There's Victoria's daughter, Emma. Is it Emma?
Emma.
Yeah.
Emma Jane.
Emma Jane. And then Ethel Westall is the granddaughter. So 4 generations of Sheldon women there. And there's Henry, the other boy who was born there in Mandarin. They refer to Henry and the family as a cripple. You can tell he's physically disabled. There's a couple of writings they refer to him as a hunchback. The terminology was kind of cruel back in those days for people who were physically challenged. But it sounds like Henry is quite a navigator on the water and makes real good for the family. And so after several years, they decide to come back to New Smyrna. And when they move back to New Smyrna, they actually come back to the Murray land grant that's down in the Edgewater area. Jane says they move into a tent, and while they're living in the tent, John negotiates with the timber harvesters in the area to get some lumber, and they build a 2-story cabin there on the land. And she says that they lived there quite peacefully for a number of years. She said with game being plentiful, we were abundantly supplied. Mm-hmm. And there's one of the boys that was born there while they were living on the Murray land grant in the Edgewater area. Rudolphus ends up being the oldest lived child that Jane had. and ended up living out his life here in New Smyrna. And there's a younger picture and an older one. Kind of a stately looking guy, isn't he? And here's Zelia, standing here with a shotgun on the boat. And then there's a picture of Zelia standing in her backyard, which would have been right across the street from us, right here, in her later years. And they were both born during those 6 years that they were living there in Edgewater. In the summer of 1849, Jane leaves her mother there at the land grant and the cabin, and she goes to visit her sisters in St. Augustine. And she's gone for a time, but while she's away, John, her husband, sends her a message. And he says, hey, they're moving the troops from Fort Capron. It's okay to come back to New Smyrna. He wants her to come home. And she finds a government steamer. She goes down to see if there's a boat getting ready to depart. And as it turns out, she gets down to the dock and there's a boat ready to leave, like almost immediately. And she gathers up the kids and she gets on the boat and she heads to New Smyrna, and she realizes she forgot to send a message to John to let him know that she was actually coming back. And so she writes in this written account, she says, imagine my distress to get off the steamer at a hill about a quarter mile north of the old Kruger and DePeister plantation house and find no one waiting on me. The place afterward became known as the site of Turnbull's Castle, but was then nothing more than a shell mound belonging to Mr. Stamps. The steamer went on to the fort, and I afterwards learned that my husband had gone there to act as a guide. All the first night I spent with my children in fear of being attacked by the Indians. When morning came, I discovered a sunken boat in the river, which I raised and caulked with rags. My only thought was to get away from the mainland and hide on one of the islands in the river. I placed boards across the hull of the boat and set the smaller children on them to keep them dry. My 11-year-old daughter, which would have been Victoria then, and I used bed slats as paddles, and a small black girl bailed water as we went. Fortunately, the tide was favorable, and I was able to cross the river to Captain Dummett's old place, and I found a black family living there who gave my family food and shelter. My husband quickly located us at Captain Dummett's. However, we never returned to our old home at the Murray Grant south of New Smyrna. Mr. Sheldon had been appointed Deputy Collector of Customs in my absence, and it was necessary that we should live near the inlet. We bought the hill owned by Mr. Stamps and built a home on it. And she's talking about in 1850 when he accepts that position as the port collector here, and they buy the land that is today Old Fort Park and this land directly across from us, and move from the southern home back up here into New Smyrna Beach. So they purchased the Stamps property there. John has been working as a guide for timber haulers in this area, so he's got connections, and he negotiates for lumber to be brought down. Rudolphus says it takes his dad 8 years to build that Sheldon Hotel that's there on the mound. So I presume that they started off living in a tent the way they did on the Murray Grant when they first moved down there, probably built a first phase of the home so they had somewhere to get inside, and then started expanding on the actual home. But of course, Jane, during that time, Jane is about 40 years old, and she has her last 2 children while living here in the old Fort Park area in New Smyrna. She has Eliza Jane in 1850, and Rolando, or Uncle Raleigh as they referred to him, is born in 1854. And Rolando is actually Jane's last child. She's 41 years old at that point in time. And there's a picture of the house that they built on the hill. So I don't know if they maybe built one section, or maybe even a first floor, a single story, and then added to it. But it took some time to actually get that constructed. There is no actual photograph of that original house as it existed, just an artist rendered drawing that was created by Family Narratives. So here's the census from 1850 that was taken on the Sheldon family here in New Smyrna. And it lists all the children. Uncle Raleigh has not been born yet. He's not born until 1854. But everyone in the house, John's 40, Jane's 38 in 1850. George is 15, Victoria is 12. Henry, the physically disabled boy, is 8. It says Celia. I'm almost sure they meant Zelia. on that. Also Eliza, the younger daughter, and then two other people, a guy named, it looks like maybe George Cotting. Well, I'm not sure who George Cotting was. Arid Sheldon is John Sheldon's older brother, who came down with him from Massachusetts. And there is a picture of Uncle Raleigh, or Rolando Sheldon, who was born in 1854. And that is the only other picture that we found of Jane Sheldon. And I'm terrible at guessing ages. Anybody want to guess an age on Jane there? 34. Yeah, 34, 30 to 40, somewhere in there. Hair still parted in the middle, just like in the other old photograph. The photograph is actually labeled as Jane Murray Sheldon. So we're pretty sure that's her. So Jane talks about actually a period of relative peace while they're living here in Old Fort Park. In December of 1856, Mr. Shive moves to the New Smyrna area from Philadelphia as well. When he arrives, he's eager for a place to live. And John Sheldon leases him that two-story cabin that they had built south of here on the Murray land grant. And Mr. Shive and his wife and their two children move onto the site. Just a week or so later, two of the older Sheldon boys go duck hunting down in Mosquito Lagoon. It's getting late, so they decide to go by the Murray house down there on the land grant and check in on the Shives. They figure they can share some ducks with them and spend the night since it's getting so late. But they said as they approached, they realized that the house was gone. And they're like, oh man, they might have had a fire. But as they get closer, they see the wife and daughter dead on the shoreline. And they immediately take off. And they've been hunting ducks down here. The house in New Smyrna that they're working on is way up here. Where they find the bodies is here on that Murray land grant. Instead of coming home, in the age when it's difficult to communicate with other people, they go south. And they warn their uncle, Arid Sheldon, and the only other guy that's said to be living in the area of Oak Hill at the time, a guy named E.K. Loud, who ends up marrying Victoria Sheldon years later and being her husband. They come down, they tip off their uncle and E.K. as to what they found. Everybody makes their way back to New Smyrna. They send a party out to investigate the house, and they find the husband dead behind the house. The house has been burned down. The youngest child, the boy, was handicapped, and he was in the house, they said, when it was destroyed by fire. And they found his body as well. Jane says, all the people from a great distance gathered at our house when the murder became known, and prepared to erect a barricade around the house in case of an attack. But such preparations were useless, as there was never another Indian massacre in my section. A period of peace followed this last raid, and we were able to continue our tasks unfrightened. Then came the Civil War, which caused me to experience the greatest hardships and sorrow of my life.
Wow.
Yeah, right? It gets worse. And the murders that happened here actually end up being the first set of two murders. There's another famous murder of two young women and their two children on this property in later years in the late 1800s. This is known as the Packwood Place. And there's you hear people talk about the Packwood murders. And these two younger moms are in the house by themselves with two younger children. They end up dead. Unfortunately, a black man finds the bodies and reports the fact that he had found them. He immediately gets accused of being the one that killed them. And I think he ends up being the only one actually executed for the murders, although there are two other white men who are convicted of the murders. It's kind of a point of interest in the legal world here in Florida, because the prosecuting attorney that got the conviction on the two white men and the black man immediately filed an appeal on behalf of the two white men and acted as their defense attorney. So, yeah, right? A real head scratcher as to how that works out. The period of peace that Jane writes about only lasts about 4.5 years. And by that time, Rudolphus, or Dolph, as Jane calls him, is away at school. He's gone to school in Greenfield, Massachusetts, where his dad grew up. And then the Civil War begins. And after being accepted in the United States as a slave state in 1845, Florida cedes from the United States and actually becomes the third state to join the Confederate States. The Civil War begins in April of 1861, and over the next 11 months, activities around New Smyrna here kind of forebode of things not going well here. Although the Union Navy has set up blockades all along the eastern seaboard, New Smyrna becomes known as a port of entry for blockade runners. Early in the war, a Confederate steamer named Kate had brought in a load of firearms from the Bahamas, and additionally, a contract had been given by the U.S. government for live oak timber, and they said that several schooner loads of live oak timber that had already been paid for by the U.S. government was piled just north of Ponce Park in the river, there just north of the inlet, and was waiting on the U.S. government to come pick it up and take it back to build ships for the United States in the war effort. The Union Navy, eager to protect their timber and secure the waterway, dispatches the Henry Andrews, which is commanded by a guy named Mather, to join the Penguin, which is commanded by a commander named Bud, who is instructed, Bud's instructed to explore the depth of the waterway, and if he thought it was safe, he was supposed to escort the Henry Andrews down the waterway towards New Smyrna, and they were supposed to set up a point where they could actually control the river, which they did right along, I believe right along in this area where the Riverview Hotel would be today. And it gives you a vantage point of what's coming in the inlet and what's coming up this way. You can control traffic from both directions. And the Sheldon Hotel is here. The old stone wharf is just south of that. On the opposing side of the war, a Confederate commander has sent 2 companies of men from Fernandina to secure those weapons that had come in. And there's approximately 175 men that were said to be camped somewhere nearby New Smyrna, I think right out in the Glencoe area, more than likely. And there's a reason why I think that. I'll tell you that in a minute. The Union ships do as instructed. They anchor there, they set up. As soon as they set up anchor and they're established, a black man swims out, crawls up on one of the ships, and tells them that he had previously worked at a salt works for the Confederate Army down in the Oak Hill area. And he agrees to take them down there and actually show them where that salt works is at. And on the 24th of March of 1862, 5 boats set out, shorter, just long boats that they dropped off of those ships. They set out to explore down the river, see what they can find, and they really want to find that salt works and destroy it. They sail past the old stone wharf, and they don't realize that there's a Confederate captain named Byrd, who is there. Him and his men are working on that old stone wharf, doing some repair work, and they're getting ready to mount a howitzer gun on that. And Captain Byrd hears these guys coming in the boats. He commands all of his men to duck down in the brush. They all duck down and watch these guys sail right by. And they all just are there working away on this project. Well, on the way back, the Confederate soldiers again duck down behind the bushes. As it turns out, the field trip was not able to make it all the way to the salt works. The tide was too low. And so on their way back, since they've got extra time, they decide to stop and explore what they said looked like a stone and earthworks along the riverbank in New Smyrna. And what they had seen was the old stone wharf. Captain Byrd had orders all of his men to duck down behind the bushes, and he says, "Don't one of you fire a shot until I discharge my pistol." He said, "That's when you can shoot." And so it's really a classic military blunder. Both of the captains of both of the ships are in the first boat that hits the shore here at the old stone wharf. A soldier hops out, he goes to pull it on shore. Captain Byrd steps out of the bushes as Captain Mather is stepping out of this boat. He points his pistol at Captain Mather and tells him to surrender his men. Mather looks at his man, tells him to shove off because they're leaving. He looks back over his shoulder as he goes to get back on the boat and tells Byrd to go to hell, which is a cutting insult of the time. And Byrd shoots and kills him immediately. And of course, when he fires his pistol, everybody in the bushes opens up with all their guns. And all said and done, I think there are 9 soldiers killed, at least that many wounded, everybody, I think just about everybody in the first two boats is killed, including both of the captains of both of the boats that were supposed to be blockading the inlet on behalf of the Union Navy are killed. There's a negotiation to get the gold watches and the letters to the family back from the officers that were killed. And there is some written accounts of where the bodies are buried here in New Smyrna by the Confederates at that point in time. There's some writings also from the Union Navy. One of the guys on the ship, an Irish guy, I don't remember his name, I do remember it sounded Irish. He convinces the captain of one of the Union Navy boats to let him swim out and get the boats that were left behind. Because they had to, I think only maybe 2 or 3 of the boats of the 5 came back to the ships. And this guy goes, hey, let me swim out and I'll get the other boats and I'll bring them back. And they said he swam out there because he knew there was like a thing of whiskey, a cask of whiskey in one of the boats that they had taken for lunch. And they said he sat out there drinking out of this. They were trying to get him to come back. They're like, come back. He sits out there for quite some time and made the best of a bad situation, I guess. It was definitely a setback for the Union Navy, but they certainly did not forget about New Smyrna. Just 5 months later, John Sheldon dies unexpectedly, Jane's husband. The son that was in Massachusetts is prevented from getting home by the blockade of the eastern seaboard, and his dad tells him to come and meet him in Nassau in the Bahamas. He says, I was at school in Greenfield, Mass. When the war broke out. My father at once wrote me to set sail for Nassau and he would meet me there. I failed to come on the ship expected. He started to return, having left my mother alone. Got as far as Alistown, was seized with yellow fever and died there. And there's a picture of the old stone wharf area looking back towards where we are right now. And there's a monument that's there at the old stone wharf that commemorates that skirmish that actually occurred there. The family had talked about trying to bring John's body back. These islands really aren't that far off the coast of Florida where he's buried, but it just never came together to actually move him back to the New Smyrna area. So 7.5 months later, Jane's oldest boy, George Sheldon, Clementina's twin brother, dies of pneumonia in a Confederate hospital. And then 3 months after he passes away, on July 26th, the Union Navy comes back to New Smyrna to make good on the problems that were had here. Rudolphus is back from school by that point in time. He's made it home. And in his writings, he says, on the morning of July 26, 1863, a gunboat of 2 or 3 guns towing a schooner armed with 2 or 3 more came down and anchored off the present city dock in front of my father's house, which stood on the shell mound now known as Old Fort. At flood tide, when the vessels swung around and presented their broadsides to the house, without a word of warning, they opened fire on it, and on the Carpenter house. With long parrot shells. It was 12 o'clock noon. We had not eaten dinner, which was on the range cooking. The house he's referring to, the Carpenter house, is actually, the Sheldons had sold the property just south of Old Fort Park to a guy named Ora Carpenter, and he had built a tavern there to do business with people who were staying there in the boarding house. Rudolphus goes on, he says, at the first crash of shells through the house, we all fled to the woods. 2 hours afterwards came one of the hardest rains I ever experienced and drenched me to the skin. The boat ceased firing during the shower, and I stole up to the house by the rear entrance and succeeded in packing up enough food to last us 2 days. They opened again while I was there, and a shell came through the parlor but a few feet from me and sliced the top off of our piano as nicely as though cut with a knife. They continued shelling all night, and in the morning sent a party ashore which burned all that was left of both houses. Meantime, our situation in the forest was most pitiable. We were wet and cold. Every few minutes the sky was lit by the bursting of shells that were tearing our beautiful new house to pieces, while the roar of guns prevented sleep. We raised a smudge against the hordes of mosquitoes that attacked us, but were afraid to build a fire, lest we attract the enemy's attention. Mother, who had several times been forced to flee from Indian attacks in the Seminole War, continued calm and composed through it all, and encouraged us by her words and example. But we were glad indeed to see the early sunrise break in the east. After getting something to eat, we took up our line and marched to Glencoe in High Pine Land, 3 miles west, where there were other settlers. They were good to us, loaned us provisions, helped us set up a palm shanty, and soon we were under cover again. The reason I said I think the Confederates were likely camped or bivouacked there in Glencoe, there's writings of that skirmish that occurred, and the guide who took them out in those boats was the black man who had swam onto the boat and told them about those salt works. He was captured by the Confederates, and they said that 2 days later they hanged him in Glencoe, which makes me think they were likely camped somewhere there in that area, and it was the next high ground going west out of New Smyrna. So Jane and her kids stay in Glencoe for a little over 2 years until the fall of 1865, and then Rudolphus writes, as soon as we could, after the close of the war, in the fall of 1865, we came back and built a smaller house on the same site. It was made largely of wrecked timber picked up on the beach. The floor was puncheon-hewn plank split from logs. The shingles were split out and shaved from a drawing knife on a draw horse. And for some years, it was the only house on the present site of New Smyrna. Ora Carpenter never returned, but settled in Osteen, some miles west. He sold his land to Edmund K. Loud, who built the present Ocean House, except for the northern part, which is added by Captain Frank Sams. And here is actually an accounting of all the Sheldon's material goods and assets from when John passed away. They had to have an appraiser come in and literally value everything in the house and everything that belonged to the family so that it could be transitioned over to Jane and in her ownership. And I do mean everything, even spittoons. They list them individually. Chamber pots, beds, I mean everything. There's also human beings listed on this list. And it lists what they call Negroes that they owned. Flora, valued at $1,500. Frank, a child, at $300. Barry, or Perry, another, doesn't say whether it's a boy or girl, presumably a boy, at $200. And another girl named Rebecca that's worth $1,000. Which, when I found this, I was a little taken back at first. And then I realized what a symbol of wealth it was back then to own another human being. These people were worth more than the land. Look at the house that they had built on there. The Sheldon Hotel was only worth $3,000. Flora was worth half as much as the house. So it was really somewhat of a status symbol for these people to have these other folks, you know, in their estates, basically. Also talks about land. There's a reference here to some land known as the Brick House land. And I don't know if maybe it's a reference to the old rock house that was here in New Smyrna. I've never heard it referred to as the Brick House, but I've never heard of the Brick House either. So it does talk about a draft of the post office, and John had been appointed the first postmaster of New Smyrna while he was here. There's Jane looking over the ruins of her house on the shell mound there, or what's left of it during the Civil War. And there's the house that they built out of driftwood. And we do have one photograph of it. And it's already, you can see there's holes in the walls here. It's already in pretty rough shape by 1898. Jane's oldest daughter ends up marrying E.K. Loud, and they build the Ocean House, which set right where the Brick County building is, directly across from us here, overlooking the river. After running the Ocean House for about 12 years, Victoria and E.K. Loud sell the Ocean House to Victoria's little sister, Zelia, and her husband, Captain Frank Sams. And they put on the large addition on the north side and really make it a lot nicer and more of a venue. Here's the opening for the Canal Street Canal at Canal Street. They used to run up the north sidewalk there. And here's the Ocean House's, there's the Ocean House's bridge to Canal Street, the 100 block of Canal Street. There's a pharmacy in here, a drugstore. They've got ice cream and a post office. Postal facilities are in there at that point in time. These statues are a whole nother story for another day. Jane continues to live out her life here in New Smyrna Beach for another 30 plus years. The family built a house for her. This is the edge of the ocean house. Here's Jane's cottage, and here's a house that Captain Sam's built for him and Zelia. Rudolphus takes over running the old house that they had built out of driftwood, and Jane retires here in this cottage. Here she is standing in the front yard talking to another lady. There's actually 3 children in this photo. It's hard to make them out in these old black and white photos. There's a boy standing behind this cactus, and then 2 youngsters sitting here in the foreground. Jane ends up being very instrumental in the development of the houses of worship here in New Smyrna Beach. She donates the land for the Congregational Church. The Congregational Church is later moved just west onto Washington Avenue, and that building that was built as the first Congregational Church becomes the Baptist Church. And then in later years, it was replaced by the Baptist Church that is today the City Commission Chambers for New Smyrna. But Jane had owned that land, and she donated it for that first church to be built there. Victoria actually forms the First Daughters of American Revolution chapter here in the local area. Although that first organization doesn't last, it ends up dissolving. But Victoria remains engaged and is a part of helping get it relaunched, the one that exists today that's named after her mom. And here's Jane on the porch, visiting with some folks as she's getting up in age there. This is from the New Smyrna Breeze, June 9th, 1903. A gloom was cast over our town Sunday night by the announcement of the death of Grandma Sheldon, as she was familiarly known by all, which occurred at her home at 9:30 o'clock at the advanced age of 89 years and 9 months. While her death had been hourly expected for several days, it was nonetheless a shock to the numerous relatives and friends who had watched by her bedside with loving care and tenderness. And there are but a few people in Volusia County who will not mourn the death of Grandma Sheldon. And so I did go through and just put the information about all of Jane's kids. Jane had 10 kids in 21 years. While being a pioneer housewife here in what was developing into the territory of Florida. The kids that were born in Mandarin initially, the twins that are born in St. Augustine, George ends up living to be 27. Jane is 23 when she has him. Victoria Sheldon lives to be 65. Jane has her when she's 26. In Larry's notes on Victoria Sheldon, he says, Victoria once met a veteran of the Union forces at a dance at the old Ocean House, who had lost his hand in the war between the states. Upon their introduction, Victoria is quoted as saying, "It's certainly a pleasure to meet a Yankee who's been trimmed to my satisfaction." So she must have been a little fiery. Henry is born in Mandarin. He's the handicapped boy. He actually lives to 24. He's believed to have drowned west of the House of Refuge while transporting mail. And Jane was 29 when she had him. Rudolphus is born in 1845 when Jane is 32. He's born in what was then New Smyrna, would today be Edgewater. He lives to 89. He's the only one that lives to be as old as Jane actually lived to. Zelia was born when Jane was 34 and she lived till 67. Eliza Jane died 3 months prior to her 19th birthday. She was born here in Old Fort Park. And Rolando, the youngest boy, dies at the age of 18. But at that time he's working as a boat builder in New York and died of pneumonia. I was really surprised. I don't know if pneumonia was like the easiest description to put out there, but almost all of the kids are described as dying of pneumonia. Or consumption, yes. So that is Jane Sheldon's life in a really condensed format, really. Yeah.